Yeah.
That's wonderful. I like that.
It's very zen.
All right. Let me, yeah. Let me share here. Cool. Okay. Oh, nice. Now I can see the chat. Awesome. So this is a talk about the role of effects in NgRx authentication. So this is sort of geared towards the Angular crowd, or it's really geared towards the Angular crowd. But if you're not using Angular, these concepts will still apply to React and Vue or others, because basically NgRx is the Angular implementation of Redux. So it's the Redux pattern, but for Angular. So if you're in the React world, you might be familiar with Redux or just the use reducer hook. And if you're in Vue, I think the equivalent is Vuex, right? I don't know much Vue, but I think that's the implementation of Redux for Vue. So if you're not an Angular person, fear not. There are some applicable patterns that you'll see here. So I am a big fan of NgRx. One of the great things about NgRx is that it's a really nice piece of engineering. They've done a really good job with it. And so in addition to it being the Redux pattern, they've built in a lot of libraries and tools to help you with implementing the Redux pattern. So I'm a big fan of it, but one of the things that I have encountered over the last couple of years in learning NgRx myself and then trying to teach it to other people is that effects are one of the hardest parts of learning NgRx. So effects are this library that's part of the NgRx ecosystem. It's just NgRx/effects. And it's an integral part of NgRx, but they're really powerful and they can do a lot of things. But at the same time, they're really abstract. They're not as concrete as actions or reducers. And I think this is what kind of trips people up with it. And you actually see this if you're a React person, you see this as well. React doesn't have one official library to handle side effects, and now you have the use effect hook, but there's some similar trouble over on that side of the proverbial pond with side effects. And so they can be a little bit of a sticking point for developers. And at the same time, while effects are really difficult, authentication is always a really gnarly subject to tackle. And so if you put together NgRx plus authentication, it can be really difficult. And over the last year or so, I was giving this talk that was a little bit more broad on authentication in NgRx. I gave it at a couple of different events, and I kept running into this issue of people getting really confused because it turns out that effects are a really big part of implementing auth in NgRx. And so it doesn't take rocket scientists to kind of put two and two together and figure out that effects are sort of the biggest part of giving people anxiety of adding authentication to an NgRx application. So the goal of this talk is to help demystify some of that stuff for you and make you a little bit more relieved when you try to tackle that. So what we're going to talk about today is the role of effects in NgRx authentication. And we're going to break this into a few different sections. We're going to talk about how effects are the DJ of NgRx. We're going to talk about common struggles with effects in general. And then we're going to talk about effects in the login flow when you're logging into an application. So I've already been given a very nice introduction, so I won't spend too much time on it. I'm Sam Julien. I work for a company called Auth0. We're a identity as a service company. Basically, whenever you need to add users with permissions and log in and log out and all of that stuff, you can use our software instead of having to create it yourself. By sheer and total coincidence, we actually released a new Angular SDK today. So So that was really good timing. So I'll try to remember to drop a link somewhere to that. We had made a new React SDK just maybe a month or two ago, and now we followed up with an Angular specific SDK. I'll skip these other things because she already said that. The other thing I want to mention is that I am about to launch a book on getting started in developer relations. So if you want to check that out, it's going to be launching Friday, and I'm going to make it ridiculously cheap for a few weeks or something. So if you're interested or curious at all about developer relations, developer advocacy, speaking, writing, that kind of thing, that's what this is for. Okay, shameless self-promotion aside, let's get into the talk. So the first section here is called Effects Are the DJ of NgRx. And what we want to do here is kind of take a step back and look at this, at the architecture of NgRx. And let's first kind of compare to regular vanilla Angular. So in a regular Angular application, you would typically have your services talking directly to your components and vice versa. It'd be kind of a two-way communication between your services and your components. But in NgRx, that's not what we have. We don't have that architecture. Instead of having your services and components talk to each other directly, you have this kind of different architecture where you have reducers talking to your components, and then you have these side effects or these effects that are also communicating with your reducers. And these are all happening through dispatching actions to the store and then reading state into your components with selectors. Now, if all of those words are unfamiliar to you, that's okay. For now, just kind of don't stress out too much about that, because this talk is really more focused for people who kind of know the jargon. But if you just sort of like forget about that for a minute and just ride along with the rest of the talk, not stress out about the jargon, I think you'll get more out of it. So on the left side here are the effects, and the effects are listening for actions and handling side effects. So effects do a few different things, and I want to kind of walk through them. So effects, first of all, they decide when to call services. And I think this is sort of the main thing that people think of when they think of effects. They also communicate with APIs. And I think these are the first two things here are what people kind of naturally understand effects to be. When you need to reach out to an API that's probably contained in a service, then you use an effect to call that. That's sort of the most natural place to use an effect in NgRx. But if otherwise, there's actually a third thing that effects can do, and they can handle your control flow logic. What on earth does that mean? Another way of saying this is that effects can function like a task runner. Effects are the brain of NgRx. Mike and Brandon, who are from the core team of NgRx, they like to say that effects are the meat of the NgRx lasagna. Which is a great analogy. I like to say that effects are the DJs of the NgRx dance floor. They make sure everyone is having a good time and that the music is playing in the right order. But it's not all a bowl of cherries. There's a number of things that people struggle with effects. I struggle with these with effects. And let's walk through what those are. The first struggle people typically have is with actions that only trigger effects, meaning these are actions that don't touch the reducer at all to modify state. The second thing people struggle with usually with effects are non-dispatching effects. So these are effects that don't return an action. So it's sort of the other side of the coin. Instead of having an action that doesn't touch the reducer, you have an effect that doesn't return an action. These can be kind of tricky. And then the third thing that people tend to trip up with effects are writing complex effects. This is usually what happens when you're trying to handle multiple side effects at once. Things can get really complicated. So when it comes to NgRx and authentication, it turns out we have a little bit of an issue, because all of these things, actions that only trigger effects, non-dispatching effects, and writing complex effects, are all part of authentication in NgRx. We encounter all three of these things when we're trying to log into an application. So that takes us to the third section of the talk, which is effects in the login flow. Okay, so before we talk about NgRx plus authentication, what we should do is first talk about authentication in general. Let's look at a kind of typical flow of logging in and out of an application. So typically what happens is you have a login, it gets triggered by clicking a start button, or maybe just the application loads, and then you get sent over to some sort of provider. And that provider is where your user tends to log in, right? And then that provider is going to send them back to your Angular application or your React application or whatever else, and it's going to have to process the redirect. Inside of that redirect response is going to be either a success or an error. And so when we process the success using whatever auth SDK or JWT SDK or anything like that, we're going to get back some sort of user profile and a token. And that token is what we use to call a protected API of some kind. We also are probably going to get back a URL to redirect the user to. They might have been, say, on the accounts page, and we want to make sure that after they log in, they get sent back to the account page. So that's sort of the classic login flow of a single page application, meaning like an Angular app, a React app, Vue, whatever else. So when we go to implement this in regular Angular, we tend to make a really big authentication service. We have this big auth service, and inside of the auth service, we do a whole bunch of things. We store the token and the user in memory. We interact with whatever auth SDK we're using, and we handle all redirect logic there, like sending the user back. And we said it earlier that we have this kind of two-way communication between the auth service and the components. And what we do usually is we also have our data services in there, and we have the auth service interact with our components, and maybe we also use the auth service, or maybe add an interceptor to add the token to our outgoing calls to the API. But we don't do that in NgRx. We don't have this type of communication where we have the auth service and the components and the data services kind of wedged in the middle there. Instead, we have to fit this into this different architecture, the Redux pattern, where we have our reducers and components and effects that are interacting through actions and being read through selectors. So what happens is that auth service actually lives alongside of our effects as this thin wrapper. And the rest of the responsibilities get spread between effects, selectors, and reducers. Say that 3 times fast. So let's look a little bit closer at NgRx authentication. And when we look at that login flow again, I want you to kind of think through something. As we walk through the login flow one more time, which parts of the auth flow directly change state? So state is like the data that we're holding, the metadata that we have about our application. And side effects are the things that kind of happen but don't directly impact what we're holding as state in our application. So if we look at this again, we start the login flow where we maybe click a button or load the application. We get sent over to a provider. And then when the user logs in, we get sent over and back to our application. And then the application has to process that redirect. And so then we are processing that redirect. We either get a success or an error. And inside of the success is where we'll have our user and our token that we need to store in our application. And then we might also get that redirect URL. Okay, so in all of that stuff, what pieces of that are actually parts of state that we care about? So it's actually only the user and the token. In that entire process, the user and the token are the only things that we're actually going to keep in our store. We're going to have our state interface that's going to look something like this, where we store our user profile and our access token. Everything else in that entire flow is a side effect, which means that everything else needs effects. Now, one thing I want to back up for a second. You might be wondering whether that redirect there is something that we're going to keep in state, but we're actually not really going to keep it. We're only going to hold it in memory for a second until we send the user off to wherever they're going. We don't need a long-term, we don't need to hold on to that for the rest of the time. So that's why only the user and the token are parts of the state. Okay, so everything else needs effects. So let's divide the login flow in half and just take it one piece at a time. So let's first zoom in on starting the login and logging in and see how we would implement that in NgRx. So what we would do is we would first create an action. We would have this action to start our login process, basically. And then that action is going to get dispatched, and we're going to need an effect that's going to listen for that action. So we have our effect. I'm using, in all these examples, I use all of the helper functions that were introduced in NgRx 8. So here's one for create effect. And so this effect is going to listen for the login action, and then it's going to call the tap operator and call our auth services login function. So the tap operator is used for side effects. Notice that we're not returning a new action here. Usually we would be dispatching a new action, but we're not doing that. So we're going to use the tap operator. Now this login function right here, this is part of our auth service. So let's just kind of look in on that and see what that is. So the auth service here has this login method. And you can see that this login method is literally just a little bit of a wrapper around the auth client's login with redirect method. So the auth client is whatever SDK you might be using to interact with your authorization server. So we're calling that login method here. And we have the tap operator because we're not returning a new action. And then we have to use this dispatch set to false. Since we're not returning a new action, we need to tell NgRx that we're setting dispatch to false so that we don't get into some sort of infinite loop. So that is our login effect. And if you go back and look at the struggles that we had in the beginning about effects, you'll notice that this is both an action that only triggers an effect and it's a non-dispatching effect. And we're only at the login process. We've only literally just clicked the login button. So what can we do here? How do we solve this hurdle, this mental block? Well, one thing that really helps here is to remember that effects function as a task runner. They are the DJ of the NgRx dance floor. So I said that earlier and I was kind of kidding, but what do I actually mean by that? Well, if you think about it, if you were to tell the DJ to play your favorite song, nothing happens instantly. Unless the DJ starts serenading you on the spot, nothing happens instantaneously. Instead, what has to happen, right? The DJ has to go grab the record, they've got to put it on the player, and then they've actually got to play the song. And if you kind of think about this in terms of side effects or tasks, and then state, I'm really fun at parties. I make comparisons of DJs to state management in Angular. Grabbing a record and putting it on the player are just side effects. They don't actually change anything. It's only playing the song that actually does anything. And that's sort of what's happening when you call your login. When you say, hey app, log me in, a few different things has to happen. You have to call the auth service to log in, you got to handle the redirect flow, and then you've got to update the store. And so all of this stuff leading up to it are just tasks that have to run before the state actually changes. And that's why they're side effects. So that's what's happening over there. And if we go back and look through our login process here, it's only at the end that we're getting our state. So let's look at this again, and let's go through our handle redirect, the second half of this. So we have our handle redirect here. We're going to have an action for handling the redirect, and then we're going to create an effect. So we're creating our effect that's listening for the handle redirect action that gets dispatched. And then we have our NgRx, our RxJS operator. Here we're using exhaust map. Exhaust map just ignores subsequent requests. So if you click on a button once, it waits for that request to complete. If you were to click it a bazillion times, it would ignore clicks 2 through bazillion until the first one completed. So what do we do inside of this exhaust map? So this is where things get a little complicated and confusing when you try to implement this. So you're going to call your auth service to handle the redirect when you're back at your application. This is basically just the call for the SDK to go get your access token and your user profile and where to send the user. And then that handle redirect is going to be an observable. And so inside of that, you're going to need to map into that. And then things get kind of muddy. Like, we're going to do this, we're going to catch an error somehow, but what actually do we need to do here? We still need to go get the user and token and set it somewhere. We need to send the user to the redirect URL, and then we're going to dispatch this handle redirect success action. That seems like a lot. It doesn't seem like it makes any sense. And you're right, it doesn't. There's a lot happening here. And this is where we come to writing complex effects. This is where things are, if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by writing an effect, chances are you have more than one effect that you're trying to figure out here. So what we have to do here is we have to go back and we have to find the hidden side effect. We have to figure out what's going on here and break this effect apart into multiple effects. So if we go back and look at this, we're calling handle redirect, and then we're processing the success and the error. But what happens is we've somehow combined multiple side effects. If you think about it, handling the redirect itself is actually already a side effect because we're calling out to another service and expecting some sort of result that doesn't affect our state. So we need two different effects here, and we need to break it into smaller pieces. So in general, what you want to do is let one effect handle one side effect. So typically what people tend to do in the beginning with NgRx is they try to cram multiple things into one effect. And that's where things get complicated and people tend to have trouble. So let's write out these steps like we did before with the login flow. So when we get to the second half of coming back to the application, the first thing we need to do is call the auth service to process everything. Then what we need to do is update the store. And finally, what we need to do is redirect the user to that URL that came back. So if we think about what in here is a side effect and what is updating state, well, it's number two. Number two is updating the store. And so the other two things are just side effects. So we actually need two effects there to handle that. So if we go back to our effect, we can refactor this to make it a little bit clearer. Instead of having this section here where we're kind of muddling around trying to figure out what to do, what we can do is break this apart into a couple of different steps here. So instead, what we're going to do is dispatch a new action, or dispatch the handle redirect success action, and we'll send along with it the payload that the auth service is giving us from the handle redirect, and that'll include that redirect URL. So we'll have the token, the user, and the redirect URL. So that handle redirect success action is going to dispatch here, and then we're going to head back over to the reducer and create a new case in our reducer. So reducers are where the state gets updated. So we're going to listen for that handle redirect success action, and we're going to update the store. We're going to put our token in and our user in. And so since we've done that, now we need to create a new effect. So we're going to create an effect, and it's going to listen for that handle redirect success action. And then again, we're going to use our tap operator, and we're going to just navigate the user over to the new URL. And lastly, we have to have that dispatch set to false option there since we're not returning a new action. Okay, so we've now looked at the entire login process, and we've seen all three of our struggles here: actions that only trigger effects, non-dispatching actions, and complex effects all at once. And I know I hit you with a ton of information, so let's do a quick review. So at the beginning of the talk, I said that effects are one of the hardest parts of learning NgRx, and at the same time, they're a huge part of implementing authentication in NgRx. And so in an Angular app, we normally have an auth service that's interacting with our components and maybe our data services, and the auth service handles everything for us. But when we look at NgRx architecture, all of that gets changed into this Redux pattern where we have reducers and components and effects and actions and selectors, and our auth service just becomes this thin layer alongside of our effects. We also talked about how effects have a few different functions. One, they decide when to call our services. Two, they communicate with our APIs. And three, they handle control flow logic. And it's these first two that people tend to have click early on, but the third one is a little bit complicated. And handling control flow logic is the equivalent of being the brain of NgRx, the meat of the NgRx lasagna, the DJs of the NgRx dance floor. We also talked about how effects have a few different things that people struggle with. Actions that only trigger effects, non-dispatching effects, and writing complex effects. And conveniently or inconveniently for us, all three of those things show up when you try to add auth to an NgRx app or any Redux app. So then we broke it down and looked at our login process where we log into the provider. And here we encountered our first two struggles. And to help with that, we had to remember that effects act as a task runner. So we wrote out the steps of this part of the process, calling the auth service to log in, handling the redirect flow, and updating the store. And then in our second half of the login process, we go get the user and the token, and we handle the redirect. And here is where we encountered the complex effect. We were basically trying to do that entire thing in one effect. So we learned that we need to go back and find the hidden side effect whenever we encounter something so complex like that. We need to break a complex effect into smaller pieces and let only one effect handle one side effect. So we did the same thing where we wrote out our steps, where we call the auth service to process, update the store, and redirect the user. And it turns out that only that second part was updating the store, and the other two were side effects. And that's why we needed two effects, or two actions that we needed to process. So we had our three struggles, and we managed to clear up all three of them. So hopefully this talk has gotten you from having a mild panic attack every time you look at an NgRx app to being a little bit more relieved. So that was a lot. I have, these slides are up at samj.im/ngrxeffectsauth. Again, this was sort of a niche talk. So if you're overwhelmed by that, don't feel bad or anything. If you have any questions, I'm like super available to help clarify anything or translate anything between Angular and other frameworks. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'll hand back over the mic.
Thank you, Sam. That was really, really great. I loved all of your emojis, and I love the metaphor of having the effects be the DJ of the dance party.
Awesome.
Does anyone have any questions for Sam since we have him here? You can either unmute and just ask the question, or if you feel more comfortable, you can put a question in the chat. I'll give a minute and see if anyone has anything.
I just love Sam and Matt and Mike and their puns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny when Mike and Brandon are on stage together, because every time Mike does these puns and Sam and Brandon's just going, oh man. And the more Brandon gets upset, the funnier it is.
Sounds great. All right, well, it sounds like we have a lot of people that love the talk, but not necessarily a lot of questions, which is definitely not a bad thing. Kat says went a little bit over her head, but she learned quite a bit, which is good.
Yeah, no worries, Kat. Cher asks what platform I use for the slides. That's all Keynote.
Your slides always look really on point.
Thanks.
All right, great.
I think we'll never have any questions for Sam because it's not confusing. He just makes it so, it seems so simple.
Absolutely.
It could have been a lot more confusing though. If
Absolutely.
explained by somebody else. Sam, you did a great job.
It's a really confusing topic. I played on hard mode.
Sam.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
All right,
I do
great.
have one question. When you talked about the calling the auth service to process and splitting that functionality up to handle either the success or the error, so how does that happen? I'm new to NgRx, so I'm not quite sure how when you're saying breaking it up and then putting the call to the auth service as a separate action, how are you handling the on success and on failure?
Yeah, I should clarify that that is the whatever SDK you're using for auth is going to call out to its own authorization server. So the so for example, you'll have like a method called like handle redirect, and so the effect is calling that method on the SDK. Whatever, you'll have like a client for the library that you're using, an instance of it, and it'll process that for you. It'll like make the call and then have some sort of it'll return something successfully, or it'll have an error that you can catch. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that clears things up. So it sounds like whatever third-party service or whatever, you can tell it what, or I guess hook into how to handle what happens afterwards to then hook back into the regular life cycle of logging in.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, thanks.
Sure.
That's a great question. Thank you. All right. Well, I think with that,
Cool.
Julie.
Okay, so now we have Bonnie. I'd like to introduce Bonnie. I am so thrilled to have her. She's all the way from Amsterdam, and I can't express how happy we are to have her join us when it's